Hi, I'm Renz and let's take another easy to master class. So now our topic will be continuation of the first video that I have posted, which will deal more on capital budgeting techniques. So what are capital budgeting techniques? These are the methods that we use to evaluate projects or investments in capital budgeting decisions to determine whether they are acceptable or not for the company. So here are the capital budgeting techniques that we will tackle in this video. So we have payback period, payback reciprocal, payback bailout, accounting rate of return, net present value, IRR, profitability index, and discounted payback period. Our first method would be payback period. We have this problem here. So let us determine the payback period. Tagarting is considering a project that has the following cash flow data. What is the project's payback? How do we compute for the payback period? We will determine at which year would the company or the business would recuperate or recover the initial investment that is presented. Like in here, we have 1,150, so we key that in. 1,150. We deduct 500 for the first year. So we have not yet recovered the investment. We have 650. For the second year, we also have 500. So minus 500 as well. So we still have 150. So for the third year, we will have this 150 divided by the cash inflows for the third year, which is 500. Now we have 0.3. So the response or answer here would be 2.3 years. So as a shortcut, if the cash flows are uniform, we can instead do like 1,150, which is the initial investment, divided by the periodic cash flows, which is 500. So we will still get the same answer, 2.3 years. So in deciding whether an investment is acceptable, how would we use payback period? So the decision criteria here is the shorter or the lower the payback period, the better or the more acceptable it is. Now we go to payback reciprocal. How do we compute payback reciprocal? It is simply 1 divided by the payback period. So we have computed the payback period for this investment or for this company. Now, how do we compute for the payback reciprocal? We key in 1 divided by 2.3. We will get 43.48%. So how will we determine if the payback reciprocal is desirable or not? The higher the payback reciprocal, the better it is or the more acceptable the investment is. So this is in reverse to the payback period. Now we have payback bailout period. What is payback bailout period? This is similar to payback period, but the only difference that they have is payback bailout period considers the salvage value of the investment or the cash outlay. How would that happen? So we will consider as if the investment was sold at the time the company recovered the money from the investment. So ang gagawin natin is as if bebenta mo yung investment at the last time of the payback bailout period. So let's still use this given, but now we will include salvage value. So in here, what we will do is we have 1,150 minus the cash flow for year 1, which is 500. Now you have still 650 to recover from the investment. You will now consider the salvage value of 400. If you will consider the salvage value of 400, would you have recovered the entire investment? The answer there is not yet. So you will still move forward with the 650 and you will deduct the 500 of the second year. So you still have 150 to recover. Now you have the salvage value of 200. If you would consider that, would you have recovered the entire investment? The answer is yes. But how would you consider the salvage value? It should be considered in full. Why? Kasi sa loob ng isang taon, you will realize the cash flows, operating cash flows in an investment, assuming evenly. But the salvage value, you will recognize that at a point in time. So how would we compute for the payback bailout period? We now have the 650 remaining from year 1. We will first consider the salvage value minus 200. We still now have 450 to recover divided by the cash flow at year 2 divided by 500, so we have 0.9. We add that with 1 year because 1 year have passed, so the answer would be 1.9 years. So what is the decision criteria here at payback bailout period? The lower the better. Obviously, you would yield a lower amount of payback bailout period than your ordinary payback period because your consideration at payback bailout is at the end of the payback period, you would sell the asset. Meaning, you would have an additional cash inflow. That is only the assumption. You would not actually sell the asset at the end of the payback bailout period. Now, we talk about the advantages and disadvantages of using the payback method in capital budgeting decisions. So the advantages here would include they are easy to compute and understand. As we have performed a while ago, they can be computed easily. Now, payback period or the payback method in evaluating capital budgeting decisions are used to measure degree of risk. Why? The higher the payback period or the lower the payback reciprocal, the higher the risks involved because the longer the time that you need to recover the investment, the more uncertain the inflows are. Because if you are the investor, you would most likely want to recover the investment as soon as possible so that your cash outlay is secured. If the cash outlay is secured, then risks are minimal or less than those with longer paybacks. Now, in here, it is very intuitive that the longer the payback period or the lower the payback reciprocal, the higher the risk involved. So you do not need a base for you to determine whether the payback is risky when you are comparing two investments. Now, this is used for quick return projects, meaning if you have spare cash and then you want to invest in a project, you don't want the money to be idle, then you use this payback method in evaluating the project. What are the disadvantages or cons of using the payback method? It ignores the time value of money. We will discuss soon, or maybe you have learned from your financial management class that a money received today would have different value tomorrow, or it would have had a different value yesterday. Because 1 peso today is worth less than 1 peso the next day. It might not even give you 1 peso value of goods the following day or the following year. So if you would hold 1,000 peso now and you would wait for 10 years before you spend it, you can buy less on that 1,000 pesos in 10 years than now. So that portion of finance is ignored in the payback method. Also, it ignores the cash flows that you will realize after the payback period. As you have seen we have not even considered the third year of the investment, even if the investment still has a year before it matures. Now, what would happen to the cash flows after the payback period? You would not consider them anymore because you are only concerned on how fast you would recover the investment. That is the primary concern of the payback method. Now, economic lives are also not considered. So if you have a short lifespan of an investment and a long lifespan of an investment, if the shorter lifespan investment would have a lower payback period, it would most probably be the more acceptable investment than the one with a longer lifespan but a longer or higher payback period. We don't know, maybe the investment with a longer lifespan would yield more inflows to you in the long run, but you will not determine that if you would use payback method in evaluating your investment decisions. Conventional payback ignores salvage value. Except for the payback bailout, the other methods, they ignore the salvage value. But even in payback bailout, you consider the salvage value at the time of the payback period or the last period of the payback, in which the other cases in methods which are not the payback method, they consider the salvage at the end of the investment. Next, the measure that we use for the payback method is the liquidity and not profitability. You are more concerned on the recoverability of your investment than its profitability or its ability to generate income for you. Because if you are concerned more on how fast you would recover the investment, then you would choose investments which yield cash flows at the earlier period or the more secure cash flows, rather than an investment with a long lifespan and more cash flows in the long run. So for business people, if you have a higher amount of cash to invest, you would most likely not want to recover that investment on a shorter span if that means that you would want to have the business in the long run. So you would most probably use more sophisticated methods of deciding on your capital budgeting decisions. Next is, it does not support the wealth maximization objective of financial management. So if you would use payback method, your concern is mostly on the recoverability of your investment rather than its ability to generate income for you. Moving forward, we have the accounting rate of return. So the accounting rate of return is computed using the income that is computed in the financial statements over the investment, the financial statement amount of the investment that is used. So we have the problem here. Matthew Corporation is considering the production of a new product line which will require an investment of 10 million pesos. No scrap value. The investment will have a useful life of 5 years, during which annual net cash flows before taxes of 3,500,000 are expected. The income tax rate is 40%. So let us compute first the net income of the company, because that is the amount to be used in this problem. So we have 3,500,000 minus the depreciation of 10 million divided by 5 years, rather. You would have 2 million. So 1.5 million times 0.6. So your net income would be 900,000. Now, you would consider that in computing for your accounting rate of return, which is computed by the net income divided by the investment. We have two methods to compute the accounting rate of return. We may consider using the average investment or the original investment. So if we would use original investment as a denominator, Let's key that in. 900,000 divided by the original investment of 10 million. You would have 9%. But if you would use the average investment, you would get the value of the investment at the start, which is 10 million, plus the value of the investment at the end of life, which in here, you have no scrap value, so therefore it's 0, plus 0, 10 million, divided by the life of the investment, 5, divided by 2 rather. So 10 million divided by 2, you have 5 million. Now, 900,000 divided by the average investment of 5 million, you would have 18%. So what would be the correct answer in this? Is it asking for the original ARR or the average ARR? So the answer there is, actually, we cannot tell, neither. But if you would ask me, if you are the investor, you would be more conservative on this. But in practice, in reality, the company has set guidelines on which accounting rate of return are they pertaining to. They would mention that in computation of the accounting rate of return. You might have used average investment or original investment as a company, but they explicitly state that. So the decision criteria here is, the higher the ARR, the better. Meaning, the more that the company realizes from its income. So for the accounting rate of return, what are the pros and cons here? The advantages would be, it is easy to understand. Meaning, if you have a high ARR, you have a high return per asset employed in the company. Meaning, if you have 9%, for every 1 peso that you invest in the company, 9 cents is your realized value on that period. It is a preliminary screening device. It can be used as an initial measurement for the investment on whether they are acceptable or not, because initially, if the company yields, or if the business or the investment yields low ARR, meaning it does not realize that much income per period. What are the disadvantages here? It ignores time value of money once more. And as an ARR, it does not conceive as an accounting rate of return, meaning you would use accounting income and the accounting investment amount. It ignores cash flow timing, or it considers the financial statement income and the financial statement amount of the investment. It also has different bases on averaging. As we have computed a while ago, we don't know if we would use average or original. If you would compute for that in your problems or in materials, they would indicate if it is average or original. But if it is silent, then you can compute for both and see if which amount appears on your answer. But as a company, it is difficult to compare ARR from one company to another if especially they do not use the same base. Maybe one uses original and one uses average. And the figures are based on the financial statements, in which in finance, we consider cash flows or the timing of cash flows rather than the booked amount of income and investment, because we have opportunity costs as well. And those cash outlays that are not considered or are not considered as part of the investment, which we consider during capital budgeting decisions. Now let's move on to discounted cash flow techniques. So discounted cash flow techniques, in here we consider the time value of money. So this is in response to the shortcomings of the other two methods that we had. So in here, we also consider all the cash flows across the life of the investment, and it focuses more on the cash flows rather than the accounting basis that we have computed. So in here, we consider opportunity costs as well. What are the disadvantages? Well, it is relatively not that easy to understand because it employs complex or difficult computations, as it was mentioned here. It makes use of time value computations, so present value and future value computations. It requires forecasts pertaining up to the end of the life of the asset. So you need a detailed analysis on the cash flows that you consider in the investment. And what else? It requires cost of capital, or the amount that you would use, or the percentage that you would use for discounting the investment or the cash flows that would be realized from the investment. So let's answer some problems here. So for net present value, we have this problem. So Warnock Inc. is considering a project that has the following cash flow and WACC data. What is the project's NPV? So given the WACC, or weighted average cost of capital, of 10%, you have cash flows of 950, 500, 400, and 300 respectively. So the cash flow for time 0 is 950. That would be your initial investment. So what is net present value? It is simply computed as the present value of cash inflows less the initial investment, or we will determine how much cash or how much of the initial investment would be how much of the cash inflows would remain after deducting the initial investment at time 0, given that we will determine the current value of the future cash flows. So for this, we will use the cost of capital as our discounting rate. So we need to compute for the present value of the cash flows in year 1, year 2, and year 3 respectively. We cannot use an annuity factor because the cash flows are not uniform. So for year 1, we have 500. So we will get the present value factor, 1.1, divide, then write in 1, and if you will press equals, so 1 time, you will get the present value factor of 10% for 1 year, which is 0.909 multiplied by 500. So that is the present value of the cash flow in year 1. So that we will not write that down anymore, let us press memory plus. And then for year 2, we have 1.1, divide, and then 1, and then we will press 2 times, so raise to negative 1 and then raise to negative 2, and then we will multiply this factor by 400, the cash flow on that year. We will get 330.58. We will press again memory plus so that we will store that in and add that to the cash flow in year 1. Then we'll have 1.1, divide 1, and then 3 years, so we will press equals 3 times, 1, 2, 3 times 300, and then we will press in memory plus. So the total of the present value of all cash inflows, you will get that through memory recall. You have 1010.52 minus 950, the cash outflow at time 0. So your net present value is 60.52. So how do you decide if you are using net present value as an investment, as a capital budgeting technique, or your basis for your capital budgeting decisions? As long as it exceeds 0, it is acceptable. Now, what if in some extreme scenario your net present value is 0? Will the project be acceptable? Well, that depends actually. If your discounting factor is the minimum rate of return that is required from the investment, then is the investment acceptable if the NPV is 0? then in my viewpoint, it is, because it met the minimum return. But if you are pertaining to cost of capital, then if the net present value is 0, meaning if you would have to borrow the money to invest in that investment, it would cost you like 10%, and then the net present value is 0, meaning you actually only got 10% rate of return on that investment. Why waste your time? So meaning if it is equal to 0, it is not acceptable if it is cost of capital. But if it is minimum rate of return, it might be acceptable. But we generally consider investments greater than 0 as acceptable. The higher the NPV, the more attractive the project is. Moving forward, we go to Profitability Index. So, using the same problem, how do we compute for Profitability Index? That would be PV of cash flows divided by cash outlay. Now remember, we have in our calculator the saved value of the present value of inflows. Memory recall, 1010.52 divided by 950. So our profitability index would be 1.06. So what is the acceptance criteria or decision criteria for profitability index rather? As long as it is greater than 1, it is acceptable. Because generally, if the PV of cash flows is equal to cash outlay, then the NPV would be how much? It would be 0. And if the PV of cash flows is equal to cash outlay, your profitability index would be equal to 1. So generally, if the profitability index, or actually, absolutely, if the profitability index is greater than 1, then you have a positive net present value. And if your profitability index is less than 1, your net present value is negative. Therefore, if profitability index is less than 1, NPV is negative, the project is not acceptable. And what if the profitability index is equal to 1? Then you need to consider as well the item that I have mentioned when NPV or net present value is equal to 0. Now let us move on to internal rate of return. Now internal rate of return is a factor wherein the NPV or the NPV is equal to 0 and the profitability index would be equal to 1. This would entail or require for you to use interpolation to determine the internal rate of return. Now in here, we will not make use of the cost of capital given, but we can use that as a starting point. So using the same problem, we have determined that the net present value is positive. So the higher the cost of capital that we will use for discounting the returns, the lower the present value that we will compute. Therefore, if we would have a positive NPV and our goal is to put it closer to 0, most probably we need to start at a percentage that is greater than 10%. Now, let us remove our memory recall. Now, we will try to make use of factors higher than 10% to arrive with the percentage that we need to make the NPV 0. So let's try 13%. So at 13%, so 1.13 divide 1 times 500, you will get 442.47 memory plus, then 1.13 divide by 1, then 12 times 400 memory plus, and then 1.13 divide by 1, 123 times 300 memory plus. So the present value that we will get is 963.65. Now we can write that down, 963.65, because we will use that amount for interpolation. So at 13%, you will have a present value for inflows at 963.65. At the percentage that we are looking for, the present value is, it should be 950, because 950 minus 950, then you will get an NPV of 0. So let's try 14%. So 1.14 divided by 1, then equals times 500, you'll get 48.59. Memory plus 1.14 divided by 112 times 400 equals memory plus, and then 1.14 divided by 1, and then 123 times 300, the memory plus, then if you will memory recall, it is 948 at 14%, 948.87. So now we will interpolate. So the inner values over outer values, 963.65 minus 950 over 963.65 minus 948.87. So let's key that in. 963.65 minus 950 equals, so 13.65. So memory plus, then 963.65 minus 948.87. So 14.78. Memory recall divided by 14.78, you will get 0.94 plus 13, then divided by 100, so we would get the percentage value, and then it would be 13.94%. So we will actually not get an exact amount in here because we have rounded off, but if we would use exact factors, we would get 13.92%. So what is your decision criteria here? As long as you have set a minimum required rate of return, so for example here, we have set it at 10%. Then if you exceed that rate of return, then the investment is acceptable. And the higher the internal rate of return that you have computed, the more acceptable your investment is. Next, we would have discounted payback period. So using the same information that we had, we would compute for the discounted payback. So in here, you will consider the present value of inflows per year, and you would deduct them on the initial investment, and you would determine how long it would take for you to actually recover the initial investment at the present value amounts. So we have the discounting factor is the weighted average cost of capital. So we have 1.1 divided by 1, and then equals, for raise a negative 1, times 500. So 454.54. So we would deduct this amount to 950. So let us press memory minus. Then we would have 950 memory plus, and then you would get memory recall. That is the remaining amount that you need to recover. So at year 2, we have 1.1 divided by 1, and then 1, 2 times 400. We have 330.57. Let's key in memory minus. Then if you would click memory recall, you still have 164.87 to recover. Now let's get the present value of 300 at 3 years for 10%. 1.1 divided by 1, and then 123 times 300. So 225.39. So let's key in memory recall divided by 225.39 and you will get 0.73. So let's add that 2 years plus 0.73. That would be your discounted payback. So what is the decision criteria here? The shorter the discounted payback, the better. So in summary, we would have this decision criteria for all of your capital budgeting techniques. So I hope you have learned something. You can take a screenshot of this decision criteria as your guide. So thank you and see you in my next video.